Continuing our study of Plato, we'll be looking at the next dialogue in the Plato book, Plato's Apology. Just to be clear about the title, in this case the word apology doesn't mean saying sorry, but instead it means a formal defense, like what one would make in a court of law to defend themselves against any accusations. In the last dialogue, Euthyphro, we found Socrates in front of a court because he was indicted for impiety, among other things. Well, apology covers the details of Socrates' trial and the defense he makes for himself and his actions. Before we get into this dialogue, I want to say that this dialogue was not at all what I expected from Plato. There's very little argumentation in this one, and not too much logic to chart out and follow to an ultimate point. There is a short syllogistic argument against Melitus, one of the people who was indicting Socrates, but it's not the focus of this work. Instead, what we get is a long statement by Socrates detailing his conviction about what he does and what he represents for the world and for Athens as a thinker and philosopher. The charges brought against him are that he has corrupted the Athenian youth, he teaches others to make the worse into the stronger argument, and he has been impious, namely that he doesn't believe in the gods that the other Athenian citizens believe in. For the first charge, they're basically claiming that Socrates is a sophist, i.e. someone who spouts out information as some kind of source of true knowledge. But what's important about a character like Socrates, and what makes him such a radical figure in philosophy, is that he claims to know nothing. He's neither teaching anyone truths nor asserting any truths. That is what makes him a true thinker, and that his way of thinking resides in the gray area. And that is what the figure of Socrates makes clear about knowledge itself, that it can never be promulgated as the end-all be-all. Despite claiming that he doesn't actually claim to know anything, Socrates does relate a story in which the Oracle of Delphi had named him the wisest of all men. Socrates actually disagrees with the Oracle, and he thinks that there must have been some kind of mistake. So he proceeds systematically, and talks to other men whom he considers wise and definitely wiser than him. He examines them and finds out that they are not as wise as they make it seem, and Socrates' questioning makes him very unpopular among the Athenians. What's important about Socrates is not his store of supposed knowledge, but that he is able to critically examine the world and people around him and keep his course steady as he does this. What Socrates thinks he's actually being indicted for is that he shows the people who think they're wise, i.e. the real sophists, that they're not as wise as they think. Socrates believes that they are indicting him simply because he is able to poke at their sophistic beliefs and reveal them to be false, or if not false, at least not viable to be asserted. In his defense of himself, Socrates basically outlines what it is to be a philosopher and thinker. Socrates calls himself a gadfly, who pesters and annoys a great, noble, yet slow-moving horse, a metaphor for Athens. This gadfly is necessary for the city because it acts as a way of correcting the citizens if they veer down the wrong path. This is the dialogue in which Socrates says the well-known line, "The unexamined life is not worth living." An examination here means something specific, namely the ability to ask questions logically and systematically to arrive at some kind of truth. But what really struck me in this dialogue was Socrates' conviction. Socrates, throughout his defense, lets the Athenian courtroom know that he's not afraid of dying for his actions that have angered so many because he knows what he's doing is right. Socrates won't alter what he thinks and believes to escape the penalty in court. He says he won't make a pathetic or tearful show to try to sway the jury or beg for acquittal, no matter how much they expect him to. I think with this dialogue, Plato is calling for a special focus on the role of conviction when it comes to being a philosopher. That it's not simply the pieces of information that you might know or believe, but that ultimately a philosopher believes in himself and is able to critically examine himself as well. After Socrates' defense, the trial ultimately ends in the jury finding Socrates guilty, and he is sentenced to death. At first, Socrates asks whether his sentence could be a fine or something instead of death, but the court doesn't change its mind. However, Socrates doesn't either. Socrates knows, for instance, that if he tells the courtroom that he's going to live the rest of his life quietly, no longer asking anyone questions or examining anything, that he might end up with a easier sentence. But he states that it's impossible for him to live quietly, that it disobeys the inner voice inside him that tells him what is right and what is wrong. Unsurprisingly, Socrates accepts his death sentence stoically. He says, "A good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death." What I think is important to note overall about this dialogue is that Socrates reaches a level of understanding and awareness that goes deeper than knowing individual codes or facts. That there is an attitude of openness you can take toward yourself and the world around you, in which you are not merely repeating or receiving random bits of information. Instead, you can examine life without fear. The last line of the dialogue leaves things open. Socrates says, "Now the hour to part has come. I go to die, you go to live. Which of us goes to the better lot is known to no one except the god." Even to the very end, Socrates does not claim to know what's better and what's worse. Instead, he uses his abilities as a thinker to point out the limits of his and everyone else's knowledge, the very same abilities that the courtroom was trying to restrict or put an end to. I think Socrates is a very interesting character, and I think what he represents is starting to become more clear. I believe that there are still 2 more Platonic dialogues in which Socrates plays a major role, so we'll get to see what happens to him and how he handles his death sentence while he's in jail in the next few dialogues.